In this lecture I'm going to show you how to configure DNS services on a router. So the purpose of DNS is to resolve host names to IP addresses. So when you're on a network device such as a router, in the router you want to communicate to say another router or a switch or a server, you want to sign on. You're going to use you want to sometimes use a host name instead of IP address. It's preferable to use a host name, but you need a DNS server you have to point to resolve that IP address to that host name, and that's what a DNS server does. And not to be confused with the DNS server on a host. This is different. The commands that I'm going to use on the router are DNS requests that are originating from the router itself, from a network device. The hosts themselves have their own DNS configuration that they have pointed to a DNS server for resolving application host names and things like that. So this is going to be on the router itself. So I'm going to start with router 1, and I'll just go onto the router. So I'm just going to sign on. And there's 3 primary commands. So I'm going to configure terminal. And the first command is IP domain lookup. And what that does is that enables DNS services on the router itself. And that command is by default enabled. There are times when you sometimes would want to turn it off. So as an initial command you want to make sure it is enabled, or DNS requests won't be enabled on the network device. And the next thing you want to do is point to the DNS server itself. And that's called IP name server. And you can configure more than one if you want to. You can get backup DNS servers. And so the IP address of that DNS server is actually 172.16.3.1. And that just tells the router where to send DNS requests for resolving host names to IP addresses. And the next command is going to be a domain name. And this is a company domain name. And what this does is, the command is IP domain name. And I'm going to use something like just this command. I'm going to create a domain name here. So this is a company domain name, and what this does is this allows you to create fully qualified domain names. So if you want to communicate with a device called, say, Switch2, for example, what it does is the host name for Switch2 will get appended to this domain name. So it'll be switch2.ccna.cisconetsolutions.com, and that's actually a fully qualified domain name, and it's something that some applications require, and SSH is an example where you have to have fully qualified domain names to use SSH and communicate and sign on to routers and do various network management activities. So that's the 3 commands that are required. So what I'll do at this point is run some tests. So I'm going to ping, for example, say ping router 2, for example. At this point it's sending the DNS request because router 2 has to know what the IP address is for it. So it's translating. It's going over to the domain server, and you know its domain server is the correct address. So the domain name server is configured with a table that has the mappings. So as you go through here, I have to fast forward time, and there it is there. So we get 100%. So we did resolve the name, the IP address 2.2. So another one to try is what else? So I could ping server 1 as well. That's another one to do. So I'm going to use that's a host name, server 1. And so there it does the same thing again, and this time it does a little faster. So 100%. So what I'm going to do at this point, I'm going to show you something else. I'm going to turn off DNS. So I'm going to go no IP domain lookup. Okay, now it's off. Now what I want to do is maybe run something like a ping Switch2. So nothing, unrecognized. So DNS service is off, doesn't understand the host name. So what I'll do now is I'll go and re-enable it with the just IP domain lookup. And now what I'll do it again. Now this time what I'll do is I'll just run the same ping to switch to. Make sure it works okay. And it does. And that's what I would expect now the DNS is re-enabled. And the other thing I'm going to do is just show you something else that if I go to turn it off again, so now DNS is turned off again. Now I'm going to ping, say, something else, say ping server 1, and it works. So why does it work when I've got DNS disabled? And the reason is because there's a local DNS cache on the router. If I go to show hosts, there it is there. So there's a local cache in the router. So router 1 is actually using the local cache because it knew of this previously when DNS services was enabled. And server 1's there, and so that's what it's doing instead of going to the DNS server. And so that concludes DNS services.